Chairman, Professor Rajeev, Bhargava, friends. It's a real honor for me that I have been asked to deliver this lecture in memory of Dr. Asghar Ali Engineer. I had the privilege of meeting Dr. Asghar Ali Engineer just once. I think that was in 1974. I had just joined JNU, and I think he had come to give a lecture in JNU. Not only did I attend the lecture, but afterwards one of the faculty members had invited him and a group of us to his house for dinner, at which we had a very long, extended discussion. He used to write a column for the Economic and Political Weekly at that time, because of which his name was very well known to all of us. So it was really a pleasure meeting him, and what is more, he really impressed all of us with his gentleness and his wisdom. So it's a real pleasure for me to be giving this lecture, though I must confess I feel a bit of a fraud because I'm not a political scientist. The topic I have chosen is not one on which I have any particular expertise, but on the other hand, I chose this topic because I thought the kind of topic that would have appealed to Dr. Asghar Ali Engineer. Now, democracy requires a rule for aggregating individual preferences into a social ordering. For instance, if there is some kind of a post, let us say, let's say a member of parliament has to be elected. So all of us go and we vote, and depending upon who gets the highest number of votes, that's elected. So we have a rule for aggregating individual preferences into a social ordering. And the method of majority decision is one such rule. It need not be the only rule. It need not be the rule that we should follow. Many people, for instance, argue that really unanimity is a better alternative to the method of majority decisions. Now, the problem, however, with that, as you can see, is that unanimity cannot give us a transition from individual preferences to a social ordering in all situations. Therefore, the method of majority decision is a reasonable method for aggregating individual preferences, which works in most cases, except in certain very quirky situations, which, for instance, the French political scientist or philosopher Condorcet had talked about, and which, of course, has been much discussed in the economics literature by Kenneth Arrow, Amartya Sen, and others. But leaving aside those quirky cases, the method of majority decision is something which is broadly accepted to be a hallmark of democracy. But of course, many people argue that really more important than the method of aggregating individual preferences is how you arrive at those preferences. And you arrive at those preferences through prolonged discussion. That democracy, therefore, is not just characterized by the method of majority decision, but democracy must be characterized by pervasive discussion. Amartya Sen, for instance, quoting the 19th century British author Walter Bagehot, defined democracy as government by discussion. But even if you have discussion as the basis for arriving at individual preferences, even if you have the majority decision rule as the rule for arriving at a social ordering based on individual preferences, nonetheless, something gets left out. Something very important gets left out. Discussions you can have, but on the other hand, discussions presuppose a set of more or less equally well-informed, more or less equally influential, important people who are at least accepted as important by everybody else. But we know that our societies are characterized by systematic racial, social, religious, and ethnic inequalities, because of which a whole lot of people are really kept out of the purview of discussions. Consequently, it becomes important for democracy to make sure that these people who are left out of the purview of discussions nonetheless do not become subject to a tyranny of the majority. For this, therefore, even if we have a method of majority decisions, even if we have prolonged discussions to come to a particular kind of measures of governance, all these have to be rooted in a certain soil. And that soil is provided by a set of rights, a set of universal rights enjoyed by everybody, irrespective of religion, caste, gender, ethnicity, and so on. Therefore, to my mind, even more important than the method of majority decision or than the method of discussions for arriving at individual preferences is the fact that there is a set of rights that every individual enjoys. Now, to my mind, majoritarianism uses the method of majority decision for the purpose of trampling upon or reducing the rights of a minority. And therefore, since rights constitute, to my mind, the hallmark of democracy, a basis of democracy, majoritarianism is fundamentally anti-democratic. Even though it uses an apparently democratic form, namely the method of majority decision to arrive at various kind of, positions or various measures, nonetheless, it is fundamentally anti-democratic. Now, when I say majoritarianism, I think one should distinguish between majoritarianism as I am talking about it and certain alternative kindred ways of looking at majoritarianism in order to get some clarity. Now, it is never the case that a majoritarian position is arrived at spontaneously. It's not as if people who live in close proximity to one another suddenly decide that they are going to tyrannize over a minority which happens to exist alongside of them. That's really the case. It is possible that they may not talk to one another. It is possible that there may be no contacts among them. But nonetheless, it's never the case that somebody systematically wants to actually abrogate the rights of a minority. Therefore, majoritarianism is always planned. It's planned by a political formation in order to establish a certain kind of order. Not only is it planned, but in fact the very construction of the concepts of majority and minority are themselves created. The majority that is created doesn't necessarily correspond to the empirically existing majority. When the BJP talks about Hindu Rashtra, it doesn't necessarily mean that every empirically existing Hindu is somehow going to be a part of the ruling dispensation. Likewise, the concept of the minority is also constructed. It's the created concept of the minority, which does not necessarily correspond to the empirically existing minority. And consequently, when I talk about majoritarianism, I'm really talking about a situation in which in the name of a constructed majority, the rights of the actually existing minority are abrogated on the grounds that a constructed minority did something wrong or does something wrong. So it's actually a peculiar play on the distinction between a constructed majority and minority and the actually empirically existing majority and minority, which a particular political formation uses in order to establish a majoritarian order, system, whatever. Now, also, it follows from this that majoritarianism is not necessarily in the interest of the majority. In other words, it's not as if a Hindu Rashtra is going to benefit every Hindu. Not at all. It is not so for at least two reasons. One, very obviously, the fact is that majoritarianism does not operate in the realm of material interests, in the realm of questions of life. It doesn't necessarily plan, think of, create, visualize a better life for anybody. Secondly, what it does visualize is the privileging of a constructed notion of a majority, not of the actually existing majority. For both these reasons, you'd find that majoritarianism is not even in the interest of the majority. Now, you may say that, look, I mean, how can that be? Because after all, suppose it is the case that a minority is excluded from jobs and opportunities, then more such jobs and opportunities would become available for the majority. But as a matter of fact, since the minority in any case has very little access to jobs and opportunities, its being excluded hardly creates much space for anybody else. Consequently, majoritarianism doesn't even work, doesn't even pretend to work in the interest of the empirically existing majority. And this is where my second point comes in, that majoritarianism, as I'm defining it, must be distinguished from a kindred, or something which apparently is similar, and that's the following. In most countries which were colonized, particularly if you think of African countries and so on, you always had a stratum of people who were between the colonial rulers and the oppressed majority. For instance, the Indian traders in Africa were such a group, and these people who were a small group of intermediaries between the rulers on the one hand and the oppressed majority on the other often belonged to a particular ethnic group. And as a result, you find that in many of these countries which are newly liberated, there is a movement against this particular minority group, because even though you may have got rid of colonialism, they still continue to dominate the economic and social life. Now, that kind of movement must be distinguished from majoritarianism that I'm talking about, because that movement is really against a privileged minority, and that's really, even though such a movement can take very ugly turns, it has taken ugly turns like in Idi Amin's Uganda. Nonetheless, that movement, even though it can take an ugly turn, nonetheless has an agenda which cannot be bypassed by any genuine democratic movement. Because any genuine democratic movement would want to get rid of this privileged majority, though it would like to do so in ways which are not so ugly as say in Uganda of Idi Amin. But that is to be distinguished from majoritarianism as I'm talking about, because the majoritarianism I'm talking about is something which is essentially directed against a minority which is not privileged, which is extremely oppressed. And that majoritarianism, therefore, not only is not in the interest, of course, of the minority, not even in the interest of the majority, it is per se aimed at reducing the rights of the minority. Majoritarianism does not also necessarily mean that the majority supports it. As a matter of fact, the BJP dispensation in India rules, even though it has got only 38% of the total votes. That's because of the specific oddities of our electoral system, which is ordained by the Constitution, where you find that anybody can get a very low percentage of votes and nonetheless get a majority in Parliament. So majoritarianism does not necessarily even enjoy the support of the majority. There is a certain family resemblance between majoritarianism that I'm talking about and fascism. Fascism, however, I would like to say that even though every fascism is majoritarian, every majoritarianism is not fascist. In other words, majoritarianism, by that I refer to a much wider set of situations than something which can be strictly defined as fascist. Of course, Fascism has a number of additional characteristics. One very important additional characteristic is that it's not just majoritarian, but it actually relies on lynch mobs. It relies on kind of, street violence in order to terrorize the minorities, terrorize intellectuals, terrorize liberals, and so on. The second specific feature of fascism is that it is always supported by big business houses. Fascist political formations exist in every country normally as fringe groups, but they come center stage when they are backed by big money, they are backed by big capital, they are backed by what I would call the corporate financial oligarchy. The corporate financial oligarchy finances them in order to come center stage. Why it does so is an issue that I'll come to later on. In my view, in India, we don't just have majoritarianism, but we're actually moving in the direction of fascism. We don't have a fascist state, but we certainly are moving in that direction. In any case, the kind of fascism that we can have in today's world is going to be fundamentally different from the 1930s classical version of fascism. The reasons are very simple. In the 1930s, you actually had a situation of what one may call inter-imperialist rivalry, in which you had different countries, the finance capitals, the financial oligarchies belonging to different countries, being at loggerheads against one another, in fact conflicting against one another, and therefore when one particular financial oligarchy, say in Germany, supported its fascists, those fascists not only were close to that oligarchy, but in fact they were engaged in conflicts with the British and the French and so on and so forth. While today, for carving out spheres of influence, for carving out little bits of empire. But today, we don't have inter-imperialist rivalry. Today, we don't have rival financial oligarchies. On the contrary, we actually have a process of globalization of finance. Finance is moving around freely from India to Pakistan to Poland to Greece to whatever. So, today we have a world of globalized finance. It is in the interests of globalized finance to ensure that the world is not divided into different spheres of influence so that it can move around across the globe. Cross-border movements of finance are not impeded by different bits of the globe belonging to different spheres of influence. As a result, today you cannot have a fascism of the period that you had then. You're not going to get wars of the kind that you had at that time and so on. This has a very important implication for today's fascism, and that is the following. That one of the things that fascism had done in 1930s, it came to power in the midst of unemployment, depression. It overcame the depression through state military expenditure. In Germany and in Japan, Japan was the first country to come out of the depression in 1931, and of course subsequently Germany in 1933. The states there, the fascist states, actually overcame the problem of depression through massive military spending financed by borrowing. Okay? Now, borrowing is the same as a fiscal deficit. Today, we live in a world in which, because finance is international, globalized, while the various states are nation states. We have an Indian state, we have a Pakistani state, we have a Polish state, we have whatever. The states are nation states. Every nation state is more or less obliged to listen to the whims and caprices of globalized finance. If they did not, then finance would simply leave their country. They would be reduced to a serious financial crisis. Now, finance does not like fiscal deficits. And therefore, when you have globalized finance, then its writ in the matter of fiscal deficits must run. It's not surprising that in India you have actually a law that says that the central government fiscal deficit cannot exceed 3% of the GDP. The same is true in European Union and so on. In fact, without other than the United States, it's true of most countries in the world. Why? We don't have a rule that actually says that, let's say, education expenditure must fall below 6% of GDP. We don't have a rule that says health expenditure must not fall below 3% of GDP. But we have a rule that says the fiscal deficit must not exceed 3% of the GDP of the center. Likewise, of the states, another 3%. So this is the hold of finance, and in a world in which we have globalization of finance, the nation states willy-nilly are forced to actually kowtow to globalized finance and in the process enact such legislation. Now, because of that, it is not possible for any government, including a fascist government, to actually overcome the economic crisis, because the economic crisis arises owing to a shortage of aggregate demand. Now, if the government taxes workers in order to finance larger expenditures, then of course it doesn't help demand anyway, because the workers were consuming the 100 rupees that the state takes away anyway. So if the state taxes workers, then demand goes down by 100 rupees, state expenditure raises demand by 100 rupees, there is no net expansion of demand. But on the other hand, if government expenditure is financed either by a fiscal deficit where you don't tax anybody, or by a tax on capitalists because they of course don't consume or spend their entire money that is taken away in the form of taxes, then there's a net addition to demand. Now obviously, a fascist state is not going to tax capitalists. Finance would not stand for it, and finance does not even like fiscal deficits, which is why you actually find that today's fascism, unlike in 1931 or 33, really has no means of overcoming the economic crisis that actually brought it center stage in the first place. In fact, this is quite important because if you look at Germany, there was a period during which fascists became very popular. Before the horrors of war began, there was a brief period in which the workers got employment, the economy came out of the crisis, and there was a period in which the electorate actually was quite impressed with the fascists for having overcome the depression. That is something which is not going to happen today. I'm going to discuss the implications of this later on. So, today's fascism, therefore, cannot be the same as the 1930s fascism. So anybody who says that today is, look at this, we cannot call it fascist, is something, we have to be careful that even though it cannot be a replica of 1930s fascism, we are moving in a fascist direction. In fact, in India, the support of the financial oligarchy for the government formation, for the fascistic formation, the fact that there are street mobs, lynch mobs which are operating, all these are really symptoms of fascism. But I shall restrict myself to simply calling it majoritarianism, because let's not get into the kind of terrain which is much debated, and I don't want to get into that because that will really sidetrack me. So the question which arises is, why should there be in our democratic polity the emergence of such a majoritarian tendency? The answer to this question, or this question requires an answer at two very different levels. At one level, the question is, what is the conjuncture? What is the context that actually produces such a majoritarian tendency? And to my mind, that context is provided by a context of an economic crisis. Obviously, we know that the economic crisis, which is really beginning to appear in a particularly deep form now, has been with us for some time, and it's not very surprising that that economic crisis creates the conditions for the generation, for the spread of fascism. Now, I said earlier that the majoritarian formation is not really concerned about the material improvement in the conditions of the people. On the other hand, the lack of the material deprivation of the people is paradoxically what produces the conditions for the growth of majoritarianism. There's no contradiction between the two. At the same time, the reason for the corporate support for majoritarianism is also provided by this crisis, because in this crisis, obviously, the corporates or the corporate financial oligarchy often gets worried that there may be a change in policy, maybe that there would be a change in dispensation, and if there's a change in dispensation, they are threatened. And therefore, they encourage a shift of discourse of the kind that we have, where the economy or the material conditions of the people are no longer occupying the minds of the people, but something else, namely the rights of minorities, how they are anti-national, how they are traitors, and so on. That begins to occupy the people's minds, and such a change in discourse is something which is to the interests of the corporate financial oligarchy. It's not surprising that they fund majoritarian movements lavishly. If you look at figures, for instance, in the last parliamentary elections, the BJP spent 27,000 crores of rupees, and 27,000 crores implies about 50 crores per parliamentary constituency, which is way above that which any other political formation could possibly even come anywhere near spending. And how did they get that support? That support actually arises because of the fact that we have a fusion of corporate power with state power. And that's something which our current majoritarianism has really brought about. But at a second level, then one can ask, how is it that, all right, that may provide the context for the growth of majoritarianism, but then how could they actually acquire this kind of a hold on our society, which is really quite disturbing? And I think here one has to look at specific instruments which they use. One instrument, of course, which I've already mentioned, is the fact that in our country, you can get 38% of votes and even so get a real kind of handsome majority in parliament. So that lacuna in our constitution is something which helps the majoritarian forces to come to power. But additionally, there is a pervasive spread of fear and insecurity that they actually bank upon. If you are critical of the government, in that case, you can be hauled up under sedition laws, you can be hauled up under UAPA, which incidentally was in fact legislated by a previous government. You can be hauled up under all kinds of draconian legislations, the Maharashtra legislation, all kinds of other draconian legislations. You can actually get hauled up, not get bail, and remain in prison for years together. I've come across people belonging to the minority community in UP who have actually been hauled up under one of these laws and kept in jail for 12 years. At the end of 12 years, when they were released, firstly, no lawyer would fight their case because a lawyer who had opted to fight their case got beaten up by the other lawyers. Secondly, even if a lawyer fights their case, cases in India keep dragging on. And when finally they were released by a miracle after 12 years of incarceration, they come out, but the stigma of having been a terrorist attaches to them. They don't even get jobs. And that is the kind of fear and dread which is spread by the draconian laws which are used without scruples by the majoritarian political formation. In addition, you have tax laws, you have enforcement directorate, you have CBI, which can be selectively used against political opponents. And that becomes a very potent source of silencing these opponents. As a result, in society, most of the time, you actually have only one side of the story that is being heard. It is amazing that, for instance, in the case of the most blatant violation of the promise of a nation, that is in the case of Kashmir, when 370 is something which is simply, they say, read down, virtually abrogated, you find a lot of political formation, including the ruling political formation in Delhi, for which I have a certain amount of regard, going ahead with this. And why? Because of the fact that they think this is the popular move, and this being the popular move, we must actually go ahead with it in order not to alienate, not to antagonize the people. So if you have only one side of the story which is being presented all the time, then of course it's not very surprising that there's one side of the story, then anybody who has any possible opposition to it rethinks that opposition and tries to fall in line with what they perceive as the majority. And as a result, this pervasive spread of dread and fear and insecurity plays a very important role. And of course, this is also promoted through a kind of hyper-nationalism, to which I'll come to later on. So this pervasive fear is a very important element. And this is, of course, something which is promoted by the media, corporate controlled media, but also given the economics of the media, where a lot of them depend upon government advertisements, they actually have to fall in line with the government that can arm twist them into supporting its position. And it is not only the media, but what is more, we have a most pusillanimous judiciary, which is also now increasingly influenced by the power of the executive into giving verdicts, which really are compromises rather than ensuring justice to the aggrieved parties. So this is the general position, and all this together, of course, with the support of the corporate financial oligarchy, is the kind of position in which majoritarian forces come to power. If you look at these instruments carefully, all of them amount to one thing: the exercise of state power. You have access to CBI because you're exercising state power. You have access to Enforcement Directorate because you're exercising state power. You can haul up anybody under UAPA or whatever because you're exercising state power. In other words, initial access to state power enables the majoritarian formations to actually tighten their hold on state power by using it against opponents in a selective, in a very targeted manner. Now, this is something which any political formation having access to state power could in principle do, but in the past, political formations having access to state power have had scruples about using such state power against opponents, but on the other hand, the majoritarian formation has no such scruples. Okay? Because of which they are actually now able to consolidate their hold on the state by using their initial access to state power. Now, this is something which, of course, raises a very important question. If majoritarianism is against the rights of the minorities, fundamentally anti-democratic, then how do we get rid of it? Because, after all, our democracy cannot survive many years of such majoritarianism. I think this question, too, has to be addressed at two levels. One level is how do we resolve it immediately? How do we overcome it immediately? At a deeper level, how do we overcome the conjuncture that produces majoritarianism, that is conducive to majoritarianism? Because even though you may get rid of it, it is not going to go away. It may in fact come back again later on. So the idea is to go beyond the conjuncture that produces majoritarianism. So how do we do both these? The answer to the first question, which is reasonably simple in my view, is in fact through political tactical alliances. You know, this is something which was tried out in the 1930s, in which Dimitrov advocated a united front against fascists. And of course, you can think in terms of all kinds of tactical alliances with whosoever is willing to come on a minimal program of doing away with the draconian laws, of controlling street mobs, of ensuring that democratic rights of the minorities are not violated, of ensuring that the secular nature of the constitution is not violated. Whosoever is willing to come on that, you can actually form an alliance with such a body, such a formation, in order to get the majoritarians out of power. Because, as I said, they use their access to state power to consolidate their position on the in the state, and therefore getting them out of power is something which is absolutely essential. The second question is a more tricky question, namely, how do we change the very conjuncture that produces majoritarianism? Now, I said that this conjuncture is marked by an economic crisis in which the majoritarians take advantage. They do not promise any, except perhaps as hyperbole sometime that we're going to double agricultural income by 2022 and so on. But leaving aside hyperboles, they don't really promise material improvement. What they do is to take advantage of the disenchantment of the people, of the alienation of the people who are caught as victims of the crisis, including the middle class, which is now increasingly, which was a votary of globalization and is now increasingly caught as a victim of globalization, as outsourcing from the US and other places is beginning to dry out of IT-related services and such like. So you have now a situation where this allows them to change the discourse, and of course what we have to do therefore is to do something about this basic context that produces majoritarianism. And this context must be one which actually overcomes the economic crisis. This economic crisis which India is currently facing is really not specific to India. It has been worsened by the follies of the BJP government, like demonetization and GST and so on, all of which have meant an attack on petty production and small capitalists. And as that sector has got progressively ruined, their demand from the rest of the economy has again dwindled, because of which the rest of the economy also begins to feel the crisis which initially affected them. So you have, of course, the follies of the BJP government, but I think it will be wrong to see this crisis entirely as a result of the follies of the BJP government. This crisis is also something which is analogous to the crisis being faced in the rest of the world. After all, right-wing tendencies are coming up not just here, but everywhere. Majoritarian tendencies, fascistic tendencies are really now universally mushrooming. This crisis is really, to my mind, a crisis of neoliberalism. That neoliberal capitalism has now reached a kind of dead end. And in fact, within neoliberal capitalism, there is no way of overcoming this crisis. I mentioned earlier that this crisis would require an increase in the level of aggregate demand. This increase in the level of aggregate demand would require state initiative, state expenditure. And if state expenditure is financed not by taxes on the capitalists or by a fiscal deficit, both of which would be opposed by globalized finance capital, in that case, there is no way of coming out of the crisis. There are one possibility which could be there, which actually was suggested in the 1930s, is that you have globalized finance. Suppose you had a global state, or even if you didn't have a global state, you actually had a surrogate global state in which all the different, at least let's say 10, 15, 20 major countries got together and decided to enlarge the fiscal deficit. Then finance is not going to go to the moon. And therefore, willy-nilly, finance would have to accept such a proposal to boost aggregate demand. But of course, there are no signs of it. You're not having a global state or a surrogate global state which is intent on promoting fiscal stimulation of the world economy. Therefore, this crisis is one for which there is no solution, to my mind, within neoliberal capitalism as we have known it till now. To overcome this crisis, therefore, requires specific measures that may not be acceptable to globalized finance, but we have to persist with these measures. Now, to say that we actually change the context, change the conjuncture by having some kind of an alternative agenda that improves the material conditions of the people, does not mean that the majoritarians talk nationalism and we talk economics. That is not my idea. In fact, our idea of improving the conditions of the people must itself be embedded within an alternative idea of the nation, an alternative ways of forming the nation, which is in fact an alternative to the hyper-nationalism of the majoritarians. Now, this alternative is not something which is new. In fact, this alternative was actually the alternative on the basis of which this nation came into existence. Our anti-colonial nationalism was fundamentally different, fundamentally opposite of what today we are being asked to accept in the name of hyper-nationalism. It was different in at least three ways. Firstly, our anti-colonial nationalism was inclusive. It did not locate enemies within. On the contrary, it actually made accommodations in order to incorporate everybody into the anti-colonial struggle, which is not very surprising because you're facing a very powerful enemy and therefore you had to incorporate everybody into the struggle. And it's not surprising that you actually had articles like 370, 371, which were means of such accommodation. Secondly, our anti-colonial nationalism did not place the nation above the people. That basically, that the people have to make sacrifices for the nation. This is something which is true of the aggressive, aggrandizing European nationalism that came into vogue after the Westphalian peace treaties, but this is something which did not characterize anti-colonial nationalism. On the contrary, you remember Gandhi's remark that basically the idea was to wipe away the tears from the eyes of every Indian. So the raison d'etre of the nation was to serve the people. And that is something which again has been altered. And of course, the third basic idea is that this concept of a nation that we had from the anti-colonial days was an anti-imperialist. It did not itself wish to conquer other nations. It did not itself wish to embark on an imperialist project. While today, even though you cannot really embark on a large-scale imperialist project, the mindset that produces some kind of an imperialism, sub-imperialism, is something which is evident, for instance, in the government's actions vis-à-vis Kashmir. So, in all these ways, today's hyper-nationalism is not only different from, but is the very opposite of the anti-colonial nationalism. The anti-colonial nationalism had emphasized, because it placed people above the nation, because the nation was to serve the people, it emphasized a discourse of material improvement. Now, for instance, the anti-colonial nationalism presented an agenda, like a freedom charter. It presented an agenda in 1931 in the Karachi Congress resolution, in which a lot of things were stated. Universal adult franchise, the fact that everybody has a set of fundamental rights, equality before law irrespective of differences in gender, ethnicity, religion, and so on. Free and compulsory primary education, which we still don't have. Abolition of capital punishment. Students in my university are called anti-national because they many of them attended a meeting that was protesting the capital punishment against Afzal Guru. But abolition of capital punishment was one of the terms of the 1931 Karachi Congress resolution, which we still have not put in. And of course, the fact that every Indian must have a certain material standard of life, a certain minimum material standard of life. Therefore, placing economics in the midst of a discourse of an alternative nationalism, fighting for this alternative nationalism must be the way for changing the context. And here I would suggest that the Karachi Congress resolution went only part of the way, that it is very important now to actually extend it further. And one way that I would like to extend it further is by instituting a set of universal economic rights. Now, our constitution, as you know, placed a lot of the things having to do with the betterment of the people in economic terms into the directive principles of state policy, which are not enforceable, which are not justiciable, which basically are a set of pious wishes. So we have fundamental rights of a political kind, but we don't have any fundamental economic rights. I believe that one way in which we can really give a meaning to our democracy, we can really bring our anti-colonial nationalism to a certain fruition, is by instituting a set of fundamental economic rights. When I talk of fundamental economic rights, there are two kinds of objections theoretically which would be raised against them. One is the liberal objection, which says that, look, how can you have rights which the state cannot really guarantee? In other words, you may say right to full employment or right to employment, but if the right to employment cannot be guaranteed by the state, then what's the point of having such a right? Now that, to my mind, is unacceptable, because that privileges a particular economic arrangement over the demands of democracy. Democracy requires that everybody must have, society must provide employment to all. But if society's provision of employment to all is impeded by the economic arrangement we have, the arrangement of neoliberal capitalism, in that case we should be changing the arrangement rather than compromising on the demands of democracy. And in fact, if you accept that logic, then of course you can never get out of the status quo, because the status quo is what is permitted. If you go out of the status quo, then you are in trouble, because this is something which the state cannot guarantee. Therefore, I reject that kind of argument. There is a second kind of argument against rights, which is actually put forward by the left. And that argument was presented by Marx in an early essay on the Jewish question. Marx actually criticized liberalism. Marx's criticism of liberalism is contained in an early essay called On the Jewish Question, in which Marx said that rights are enjoyed by individuals. Rights are enjoyed by individuals who are like monads, who are like little atoms. But on the other hand, human freedom requires the formation of a community, that people must come together to strive for freedom and to achieve freedom. And therefore, giving individual rights as atoms, to individuals and atoms, is something which does not constitute human freedom. Now, I think Marx was certainly right in this, but on the other hand, the problem with this position is that Marx thought that liberalism would actually succeed in achieving a set of economic rights, including rights to employment and so on, which it has not been, because they are fundamentally issues in which capitalism, being a spontaneous system, okay, let me just define what I mean by spontaneous. You see, capitalism is a system in which every economic agent is competing against other economic agents, and the overall movement of the system comes out of that competition. In that sense, it's a spontaneous system. Nobody plans capitalism. It doesn't even know where it's going. But on the other hand, that where it's going is the outcome, is the aggregate outcome of a set of decisions which each individual takes, because each individual is compelled to do so, including the capitalist. Marx had referred to the capitalist as capital personified. Then the capitalist is not doing something because he has a will of his own. He's doing something because the pressure of capital makes him do something. The pressure of competition between capitals makes him do something. Now, capitalism being a spontaneous system, of course, any combination among workers and so on that breaks this spontaneity. But what is more, any struggle for economic rights is something that militates against the spontaneity of this system. That being the case, any such struggle would have to be the outcome of a collective action. Therefore, even to ensure individual economic rights, you have to have collective action, collective struggles. And therefore, Marx's misgivings about economic rights are really overstated. I do not, therefore, accept either of these objections to economic rights. But then, can we afford economic rights? Can we really have economic rights? I made some calculations. I'll give you the results of the calculation, then I'll stop. Suppose we have 5 economic rights. You can have more, but suppose I just calculated. Suppose we have 5 economic rights. The right to employment, failing which a person must get the full wage. The right to food. The right to universal publicly funded quality healthcare along the lines of the National Health Service in many European countries, the right to universal publicly funded quality education, to start with, let's say, at least up to the higher secondary level, subsequently at the level of the university itself. So, and of course, the right to old age pensions and disability benefits, adequate old age pensions and disability benefits. 3,000 rupees a month, let us say, is the old age pension. So if you have these 5 rights altogether, in addition to what the government is currently budgeting, I calculated you would require 16.8 lakh crores, which is roughly about 15% of the country's GDP. Okay. Now, if you have 16.8 lakh crores, economists have a notion of a multiplier, that if you actually wish to raise 16.8 lakh crores, you don't have to actually tax people additionally to the extent of 16.8 lakh crores. Because once you spend this money, income grows, automatically some taxes accrue to you even at the existing rates. So the additional taxation would be about 11.7 lakh crores. There are just two taxes. I'll give you just 2 taxes with that you can raise this very easily. One is a 2% wealth tax only on the top 1% of the wealth holders, not everybody. Only on the top 1% of the wealth holders, if you impose a 2% wealth tax, then that will give you a certain amount of money, about 6 lakh crores. Additionally, if you have a wealth tax, then you must have an inheritance tax, otherwise everybody will distribute it among his or her children. So, if you have an inheritance tax, let us say that every year about 5% of the wealth of the top 1%, only I'm talking about the top 1%, gets distributed among all kinds of legatees. Every time such wealth gets distributed, the state should take 1/3 of it. Why do I say the state should take 1/3 of it? We should be clear about it. That you see, inheritance is not justified by the philosophy of capitalism. Capitalism says, why are you rich? Capitalism says you are rich because you are talented. You did an innovation. You are an entrepreneur. You are a genius, which is why you're rich. But on the other hand, your son is not a genius. And as a result, capitalism does not support the logic of inheritance. Strictly speaking, the philosophy of capitalism does not support the logic of inheritance. And that being the case, you actually find that even if you took 1/3 of this, you know, death duties are very, very heavy in the European social democratic countries, but if you take just 1/3, then these 2 taxes, 1/3 of the 1/20th of the wealth of the top 1%, which gets passed down every year, and a 2% wealth tax would be enough to finance a welfare state in India, to finance these 5 basic rights, economic rights. If we do that, then we would have carried forward we would have carried forward the agenda of the Karachi Congress resolution. We have carried forward the Freedom Charter, and it is very important for us to discuss this so that pressure can be put on the various political formations opposed to majoritarianism to accept, if not the whole lot, at least a segment of this agenda. Thank you.
Can I kindly invite the chair, please?
Thank you for inviting me. It's a real honor to be chairing this lecture in honor of Dr. Asghar Ali Engineer. I too had been fortunate enough to spend a few days with him. You know, we academics, we really get to know each other only when we go out to attend seminars and, you know, we live together in some kind of a commune for a few days. And that's exactly what happened with me in the early 90s. I think it was 99. And it's even, you know, this solidarity, this feeling of being a real friend develops even more if you happen to go outside the country, because then you really tend to stick together. And I was very fortunate that in 1991, I think we were together in England for a conference, and I really got to know him. I would say so. When he passed away, I felt a sense of personal loss. So it's a real honor, and it's an equally a great honor to be chairing a lecture by Professor Prabhat Patnaik. Prabhat is an icon, an intellectual icon of the left, of secular progressive India, and to be chairing a lecture by him is indeed a big honor. So thank you, Irfan, for making me a part of this event. Now, you can see that Prabhat gave an absolutely superb lecture, and one of the admirable things about Prabhat is the fluency and the seamlessness with which he delivers his lecture, and not mechanically, without looking even once at his notes. I mean, he has notes, he probably has a lecture, but it doesn't really matter. He just comes and... So there he is, and you see, it's not like it's not robotic. It's not a machine delivering. It's a human being delivering the lecture. It's a unique gift that some people have, and Prabhat is one of them. So he's given an unusually clear, lucid lecture, and there were many experts, all fused. He began very modestly by saying that I'm not a political scientist, but in fact we saw not only an economist, not only a political economist, not only a political scientist, but a political theorist, all sort of fused into one. So it's a wonderful lecture and a privilege to attend it. So as you can see, I've got several notes here. And I could maybe go on for about half an hour if I were to elaborate each point, but I have only 10 minutes, and my 10 minutes begin now. Yes, of course, I forgot, I was chairing. So the first thing that I'd like to make explicit, which was implicit in Prabhat's lecture, is that we have been working with two notions of minority and majority, which tend to get conflated, and which, in fact, are in our political discourse and in our philosophical literature too. They get very easily conflated. One, of course, is something that Prabhat mentioned, which is what we might call a preference. A dependent or preference-based minority and majority. So if you have lots of individuals and they express their preferences, and if you aggregate those preferences, then you produce one, and if they are different and there's no unanimity, if there are different, let's say the differences are just on one variable, then you have a numerical majority and a numerical minority, right? Whether it's 51-49 or 70-30 or whatever that is. And electoral majorities and minorities in democracies are produced in this fashion. So there are winners and losers, but in democracies, these political majorities and minorities, they are temporary. You lose, you get defeated, but there's always a hope that in the next round you can be the winner, and so there can be a rotation between of power between what is a minority today can get power some other time, in future, in 5 years, in 10 years, so on. Now that's a democratic notion of minority and majority, but then you have a notion of majority and minority that is that we may say is coming from a certain identity or nationalism, a particular kind of nationalism discourse, where these preferences are more or less congealed. In other words, these minorities and majorities are constituted by certain attributes that you happen to have, which are in fact, constitutive of your identities. And then, say, language. You don't change your mother tongue that often. These are not stable. This is not a preference like a desire for something that you have and you can change. Likewise, although people change their religions and people give up their religion and become irreligious, religion too is one of those attributes that people don't change that easily. So you can say that these are more or less congealed preferences, and these are more or less, you might say, these are not temporary, but these are relative to the other. These are permanent majorities and minorities. I think to bring what happens in many democracies that these two they come together, they're conflated, and it's useful to remember that a lot of people, when they think of democracy is a method of decision-making which involves majority rule, very often they abandon the political notion and adopt the identitarian notion and start talking about majority rule as the rule of an ethnic majority and so on and so forth. So it's something that gets naturalized. It shouldn't get naturalized, but nonetheless it does get naturalized. And there is a way in which we have to figure out how to resolve this problem. And one of the things that happens is, and this is something which was done even in our Constitution, a clear distinction was made in the Constitution between certain features that were, or certain features on the basis of which decisions are made, which were thought to be temporary, and others which were more or less permanent. So it was assumed, for example, that Hindus and Muslims are permanent categories, and which is why, in some ways, you had to give rights to minorities. There are constitutional rights to minorities, and these minorities were linguistic or religious. So the whole Article 25 to 30 were based on this communitarian, identitarian, what we might even call a nationalist, ethnic nationalist notion of majority. And I think we haven't really worked a way around this issue, in my view. This has always been a bit of a problem for democracy, and it's also important to remember that the notions of minority and majority, because of all these things that I've explained, the notions of majority and minority are not just numerical notions. You're not a minority simply because you're small in number. You are a minority not only because you're small in number, but because you wish to have the power to shape your traditions, your social and political order. You wish to have that power, but you feel that you are deprived of that power, or you are actually deprived of that power. Then you become a real minority. So minority, the term itself, see, is a term where there's actual or potential deprivation. And that's why in many places people don't want to be called a minority. They either don't want to be labeled as minority because they feel that they are full participants in a process, or they feel threatened that if they are labeled minority, over a period of time they might be deprived of participation in that process. So I think, and that's where the point that Prabhat made about the necessity of rights, and I would say not just individual rights, but also rights which are community-based rights, whether on the basis of language or religion, even if they are temporary, including Article 370, which is also a right which is given to a community. I think these are very important rights, constitutional rights. There are some disadvantages. Nothing that you give to people, nothing that you grant to people, no gains that are made by society come without some loss. So the idea of rights also brings a certain, it takes away something from the kind of solidarity that you would want to have, the kind of community that you want to build. It creates certain differences and therefore certain divisions, and it may lead to polarization. So there is that thing in minority rights as well, but then the gains of minority rights are much more in societies which are prone to majoritarianism than the losses that there are, or the communitarian deficit that there might be when you introduce these rights. So I think ideally I would say that we would, if you look at a four-stage process, you remember, as Prabhat rightly pointed out, there was a time when a minority, there was minority rule, which was a powerful rule over the majority. And I'm thinking of all kinds of situations where that used to be the case, and where some kind of majority assertion was good against those specific kinds of minority rules. So you might say that, if that is the first stage in this kind of hypothetical schema, some minority rule which is opposed by majorities, and then you have, at the third stage, some kind of constitutional rights being given to minorities so that some equality is set up between the minority and the majority. And I think there's a fourth stage which we must aspire for, where it's not just a question of giving minorities certain rights so that they can do things separately on their own, live the way they wish to live, because that is the danger, that you may then be deprived of wider participation in the political process. There has to be a fourth moment when the minorities also become full participants in the process of decision making, and the decisions are arrived not just by majority and minority on that basis, but on the basis of some, consensually, democratically, consensually. Now, of course, we have regressed. That's how we started. Prabhat pointed out rightly that that's exactly how we started our anti-colonial struggle, our nationalist struggle, which is very different from the European nationalisms, which again Prabhat pointed out. That's how we began, to bring consensus, to have decision-making not by simple majoritarian principle, but by bringing everybody together, by having a consensus. But unfortunately, from there, we have slipped so far back that now it is not just rule by a political majority, but rule by a permanent majority, which is politically very powerful. So how Prabhat suggested a number of ways in which we can try and, very difficult situation, a number of ways in which try to get out of it. He emphasized economics and economic rights, involvement of the people in all kinds of decision making by first giving them a set of economic rights. And I think that is certainly a very important way forward, but a lot more needs to be done before we reach there. I think there are a couple of things that we need to keep in mind. One is that, all democracies, unlike the past, in non-democratic political formations, there was no real need to have a common identity on an egalitarian basis. There were separate identities, and they were all hierarchically placed, so that there were different degrees of citizenship, and it was normal for people to be like that. I think in democracies, in modern democracies, there is a need for a common identity on an egalitarian basis. And that commonness is something which carries with it. This is a complicated point which I cannot, kind of elaborate here. But this common identity carries with it an impulse to exclude. Democracy is in itself something that includes, but also it excludes. And there are ways in which we have to figure out, and this is a big, big challenge to democratic theory, right? Because of the demand for, you see, if you look at it from this point of view, just to take an example, it's very easy to accommodate people if you have to put them in their place in a hierarchy. It's more difficult to accommodate people if you have to see them as equals. India has had a tradition of putting everybody in their place in a hierarchy, which is, building an inclusive society, but which is hierarchical in some ways, where everybody's got some place in it. Now, how is it possible to build a common identity where everybody is going to be given an equal place, which is the basis of democracy? It's very easy, to say, well, let's just exclude these people and then build your common. That is something that we really need to worry about as theorists, as not just practical politicians, but as theorists, because this is something we have to really evolve many of our democratic theoretical issues here. The second thing is that, while we can focus on the more exclusivist and more aggressive forms of majoritarianism, and even say, like Prabhat did, that they really don't, talk about economic well-being. There is a whole lot of other, kind of communitarian issues in a negative sense that they deal with. It's a lot of rhetoric, and a lot of rhetoric of inclusion, even of the majority, but really they don't include everybody. Large number of people from the majority also get excluded from material benefits. Let's just pause here and look at many European societies where these societies managed to give a lot of economic, not rights, but economic benefits on a soft majoritarian basis. So there are these soft majoritarian states, most European states, most Western states, because of their legacy of a certain kind of ethno-nationalism. Most of them are soft majoritarian states. They've liquidated their diversity long ago, before they build their democracies or before they build their secularism. They already had got rid of the diversity. There were hardly any minorities left minorities not just, if you're talking about religion, minorities not just minorities of other religions, but even internal minorities. So the Protestants excluded Catholics, Catholics excluded Protestants, different denominations of Protestants excluded there. And they are, after having created these religiously homogeneous societies, they build their secularism, they build their democracy, and so on. So, and they remain like that. These are soft majoritarian states, and they are economically inclusive. This is the norm. That shows what a terrific experiment India was trying to launch in after post-colonial, in the 1950s. I think it was just it would be good to keep that in mind. And finally, I think I've just gone on for too long. I really want to talk about the difference between the majoritarianism that is a more general majoritarianism that was discussed by Prabhat, and the most specific, very peculiar, contemporary populist majoritarianism, which in India also happens to be majoritarian, scapegoating the minorities, right? How this is arisen. It's very important to know these specific features. I don't have the time for it, but I really do think that Prabhat very well and brilliantly captured not only the dynamic tension between democracies and majorities, but also how majoritarianism is really an assault on democracy. So thank you very much.